Picture this: a quiet riverbank in a foreign land, where the air is heavy with the ache of exile, and the silence carries the weight of unanswered prayers. Far from the home his ancestors once cherished, a young priest named Ezekiel sits in the stillness of the Kabar River. His heart beats with questions every refugee knows. Why has this happened? Has God forgotten us? The Babylonian sun dips low, casting a golden glow across the rippling water. And then, without warning, the ordinary shatters. The sky splits open, not in a distant rumble of storm clouds, but in a blinding burst of light that seems to tear the very fabric of the heavens. The quiet riverbank explodes with a sound like the roar of rushing waters and the rolling tumult of an army on the march. Ezekiel shields his eyes, but curiosity drives him to look. What he sees will forever redefine how humanity understands the presence of the divine. From the break in the heavens descend 4 living creatures. Unlike anything known on earth, they are at once human and otherworldly, each with 4 faces, each with wings whose movement sounds like the voice of the Almighty. Beneath them, wheels of fire turn in every direction without ever needing to pivot. Above their heads stretches something like a vast, crystalline dome, so clear, so dazzling, that it reflects the unimaginable glory above. And there, high above the crystal expanse, a radiant throne blazes with light, brighter than molten metal and shimmering like a rainbow after a violent storm. Upon it, a figure like a man sits enthroned, surrounded by a brilliance too pure for mortal eyes. This is not merely a vision. It is an encounter with the living glory of God Himself, a revelation so overwhelming that Ezekiel falls face down on the ground, trembling in awe. This moment is more than a story from ancient times. It is the dramatic opening to one of the most extraordinary journeys in all of Scripture, a journey of warning and hope, of judgment and renewal. Ezekiel's vision speaks not only to the people of his day, but to every generation searching for meaning when life feels broken and uncertain. If you are ready to step into a narrative where the supernatural collides with history, where a single man's calling ignites a message that still echoes across centuries, you have come to the right place. Stay with us as we explore the breathtaking prophecies, the vivid parables, and the astonishing promises that unfold from this first vision by the Kabar River. Before we dive deeper, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of faith, history, and hope with people around the world. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of this remarkable journey, because what Ezekiel saw that day is just the beginning of a revelation that still has the power to inspire and transform. As the blinding vision of the throne begins to fade and the thunder of heavenly wings settles into silence, Ezekiel remains face down on the riverbank, his heart pounding with the weight of what he has just seen. The world around him, the exile camp, the distant hum of Babylonian life, the slow rhythm of the Kabar River feels both strangely familiar and entirely transformed. He knows with a clarity beyond words that this is no ordinary revelation meant to dazzle and then disappear. The glory he has witnessed demands a response. Before he can even lift his head, a voice majestic and steady, filled with both authority and mercy, calls his name. It is the voice of the one who commands the heavens, and its sound carries both comfort and a charge that will alter every remaining day of his life. Son, the voice declares, using a title that reminds Ezekiel of his own frailty and humanity. Stand on your feet, and I will speak with you. Strength flows through him as though the very breath of God has entered his lungs, and he rises, trembling yet upheld by a power far greater than himself. The Lord does not speak to entertain, nor does he reveal his glory without purpose. Instead, he lays upon Ezekiel a mission that is both daunting and unavoidable. The people of Israel, scattered in exile and hardened in spirit, have turned their hearts away from their covenant. Their ears have grown dull to the call of justice and mercy. Their eyes have been blinded by pride and the lure of foreign gods. And yet the Lord refuses to let them drift away without warning. Ezekiel is appointed as a prophet, and, more than that, as a watchman, a sentinel whose duty is to stand on the walls of a city and keep his eyes fixed on the horizon. In times of danger, the watchman must not sleep, must not be distracted, and must not be silent when he sees approaching trouble. His role is not to decide how the people will respond, nor to carry the burden of their choices. His task is simply and profoundly this: to sound the alarm, to speak the truth given to him by God, and to remain faithful even when the message is met with ridicule or defiance. The Lord warns Ezekiel that the path ahead will not be smooth. He will speak to a nation that has grown stubborn, to men and women whose hearts are as unyielding as stone. Some will laugh, others will rage, and many will turn their backs. But none of this can excuse silence. Like a watchman on a city wall, Ezekiel's responsibility is not measured by the people's obedience, but by his own faithfulness to deliver the warning. If he speaks and they ignore the call, their fate rests with them. But if he withholds the message, their blood will be on his hands. The weight of this charge settles on Ezekiel's shoulders like a mantle he cannot remove. Yet it is accompanied by an unshakable sense that he is not alone. God equips his servant for the challenge ahead. He does not merely command Ezekiel to be strong. He places his own words within the prophet, feeding him a scroll inscribed with lamentations and promises of both judgment and hope. As Ezekiel tastes the scroll, he finds that it is unexpectedly sweet, a sign that even the hardest message carries within it the goodness of truth. The bitterness will come not from the words themselves, but from the resistance of those who hear them. Still, the sweetness remains a reminder that God's warnings are acts of mercy designed to awaken hearts before it is too late. Ezekiel understands now that his life is no longer his own. The familiar rhythms of priestly service in Jerusalem's temple are gone, replaced by the lonely calling of a prophet in exile. He will become a living sign, performing dramatic actions that capture the attention of a people numbed by despair. He will speak words that cut through the noise of Babylonian culture and the complacency of Israel's scattered tribes. Each declaration will carry the urgency of a watchman's trumpet, a plea to turn back before the storm of judgment fully breaks. This divine commission binds the first vision to the journey ahead. The God whose glory filled the heavens has not abandoned his people, even as they sit by foreign rivers and mourn what has been lost. He sends Ezekiel not as a bearer of mere condemnation, but as a guardian, one who stands between danger and the defenseless, one whose cry of warning is itself an invitation to repentance and renewal. In calling him Son of Man, God reminds Ezekiel and all who hear his story that the task of witnessing to truth is not the work of angels or distant heroes alone. It is the work of human hearts willing to be strengthened by the breath of the Almighty. Ezekiel's calling is more than a personal mission. It is a testament to the relentless compassion of a Creator who refuses to be silent when his people wander. The vision of blazing wheels and the radiant throne was not meant to impress but to prepare, to anchor the prophet in the certainty that the one who commands the armies of heaven will also stand beside him when the words he speaks ignite anger or scorn. The watchman's role is lonely, but it is not without hope, for every warning carries within it the possibility of salvation. And so, as the Kabar River flows quietly once more, Ezekiel stands transformed, no longer merely a priest in exile, but the vigilant sentinel of a nation's soul, entrusted with a message that must be spoken no matter the cost, a message that even in judgment whispers the enduring promise of restoration. After receiving the divine commission to serve as Israel's watchman, Ezekiel quickly realizes that words alone may not pierce the hardened hearts of a people numbed by exile, despair, and disillusionment. The vision he witnessed by the Kabar River has instilled in him a sense of awe and urgency. Yet it is clear that translating the majesty of heaven into human comprehension will require more than sermons and warnings. It will demand actions that embody the very fate awaiting Jerusalem. God calls Ezekiel to become a living symbol, to act out the drama of impending judgment in ways so vivid that no exile could mistake the gravity of their situation. In a world where metaphor often loses its impact, Ezekiel is instructed to take the impossible and make it tangible. The first sign act is one that challenges not only his understanding of ritual and purity, but also his courage and obedience. He is told to eat only a meager portion of food, a ration so small that it mirrors the scarcity his fellow Israelites will endure during the siege. The mixture is simple: wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt. A diet designed to sustain life at the barest minimum. It is a reflection of the city's coming hunger, a daily reminder to Ezekiel that the spiritual and physical famine are intertwined. Each morsel he consumes is measured carefully, every sip of water calculated, as if he himself is experiencing the siege in miniature. But the divine symbolism does not end with limited sustenance. God commands Ezekiel to cook his food over human excrement, a directive that shocks him to the core. The sacred training of a priest has never prepared him for such an act. He recoils at the thought, the air around him seeming to thicken with the weight of the command. Yet when Ezekiel voices his protest, asserting his lifelong devotion to purity and service, God responds with compassion while maintaining the lesson. Even in defilement, obedience can transform suffering into a profound message. The prophet is permitted to substitute dung with cow manure, yet the symbolism remains intact. Every meal becomes an enacted parable, each day a visual sermon demonstrating the humiliation and desperation Jerusalem will soon endure, the city itself becoming a crucible under the fires of invasion and judgment. Through these acts, Ezekiel conveys a reality that words alone cannot capture. The exiles who observe him begin to understand the severity of their situation, not merely as abstract prophecy, but as an embodied experience of their imminent calamity. When he lies on his side for extended periods, symbolically bearing the sins of the nation, or when he measures the walls of his temporary dwelling as a stand-in for the besieged city, every movement is a signpost of doom, every gesture a call to attention. Ezekiel's life, once defined by ritual and temple duties, becomes a canvas on which the tragedy of Jerusalem is painted in stark, unforgettable strokes. Yet beneath the starkness of these acts lies a profound message of hope. Each restrictive ration, each simulated defilement, each hour spent in symbolic suffering is not intended to crush the human spirit entirely, but to awaken it. Ezekiel's obedience models a path through fear and degradation, a way to remain faithful and alert even when circumstances seem hopeless. His sign acts illustrate the tangible consequences of rebellion, yet they also signal that God's care remains present, that even amidst siege, famine, and spiritual decay, there is a voice calling for recognition, repentance, and renewal. The potency of Ezekiel's actions lies in their immediacy. Exiles cannot ignore the sight of their prophet living out the fate of their homeland. His body becomes a living scroll, each movement a word of prophecy that cannot be erased. When he cooks the symbolic meal, measures the walls, or endures extended periods of physical strain, observers are confronted not just with the threat of Babylonian swords, but with the spiritual consequences of turning away from the God who has already revealed his glory to Ezekiel. These demonstrations serve to bridge the gap between vision and comprehension, between divine revelation and human understanding, making abstract judgment tangible in ways that lectures or sermons never could. Even as Ezekiel performs these acts, he is acutely aware of the loneliness inherent in his mission. The exiles look on, some with curiosity, others with disbelief or mockery, yet he persists. The responsibility of a watchman does not diminish in the face of misunderstanding. It is precisely in such moments that fidelity to God's instruction is most essential. The prophet's body, his daily routines, his discomfort, and his endurance all communicate a narrative of warning that transcends spoken words. a narrative that forces his audience to confront the reality of their spiritual and physical vulnerability. Through these sign acts, Ezekiel's prophetic ministry transforms from abstract visions into lived experiences, allowing the people of Israel to witness a tangible foretaste of the trials that await them. The migerations, the symbolic cooking, the hours of symbolic suffering all converge to form a story of judgment that is impossible to ignore. A story that binds the divine vision by the Kabar River to the exile's present reality. In this way, Ezekiel becomes both messenger and mirror, reflecting the fate of Jerusalem while embodying the hope that obedience and recognition of God's presence may yet avert complete ruin. Every action, every symbolic gesture, resonates with a profound truth. Prophecy is not merely words on a page, but a living, breathing testimony to the consequences of turning away from the path of faith, and the promise of restoration for those who listen. After enacting the vivid and unsettling sign acts that mirrored the coming siege, Ezekiel finds himself drawn once more into the realm of vision, standing at the threshold of a revelation that will pierce both his heart and the conscience of his people. The prophet is transported, not through space but through the weight of divine perception, to the very heart of Israel's spiritual life. The temple in Jerusalem, once a place of radiant holiness, its walls adorned with the artistry and devotion of generations, it now trembles under the shadow of neglect, corruption, and rebellion. The air is heavy with incense, not a pure sacrifice, but tainted by the offerings of those who have twisted worship into self-interest and idolatry, whose hands have defiled the sanctity of God's dwelling. Ezekiel's eyes are drawn upward, and with a sudden, almost unbearable clarity, he perceives the unimaginable. The glory of the Lord, the same brilliance that had thundered over the Kabar River, beginning to withdraw from the temple. It is not a distant departure, but a movement of heartbreaking precision. The radiant light that had filled every corner, that had danced across gold and stone and adorned the very presence of God, recedes step by step, leaving shadows where devotion once shone. Ezekiel falls to his face, overwhelmed not merely by what he sees, but by the weight of what it signifies. The temple is emptying of its divine essence, because the people have emptied their hearts of faithfulness, because their pride, greed, and persistent rebellion have created a space unworthy of holiness. The scene unfolds in agonizing detail. He sees the elders and leaders, who should have safeguarded the covenant, consumed by their own desires, failing to guide the people with wisdom or righteousness. Their corruption is not hidden. It is laid bare as if the very light of God exposes every deception, every act of spiritual adultery. Merchants have turned sacred spaces into marketplaces. Women practice charms and incantations for personal gain, and priests perform rituals without reverence, caring more for appearance than obedience. Each act, small or grand, has compounded the offense, creating a collective weight of sin that the glory of God can no longer bear. Ezekiel watches as the divine presence moves deliberately, passing over the altars, the Holy of Holies, the chambers where incense rises in faithful prayer, and finally ascending above the city to rest on the mountain east of Jerusalem. It is a departure, yet not an abandonment in anger, but a profound act of divine justice, a reflection of the spiritual consequences of persistent rebellion. God does not leave because he is capricious, nor because he desires to punish without cause. He leaves because holiness cannot dwell where hearts are divided, where devotion is feigned, and where the covenant has been violated too long and too consistently to ignore. The prophet sees the faces of those left behind, some in fear, others in disbelief, many unable to comprehend that what they have taken for granted, the steady, enduring presence of their God, has shifted because of their own choices. It is a vision of sorrow, of inevitability, of a reality where divine presence and human defiance cannot coexist. Ezekiel's heart aches not only for the temple, but for the people, whose repeated choices have led them to this moment. The city's walls, its gates, Its altars all remain, yet they are hollow, mere shells without the sustaining life of God's glory. In this vision, Ezekiel also perceives the broader lesson for his fellow exiles. The departure of the divine is never arbitrary, and no society can persist in rebellion without facing the spiritual and, eventually, physical consequences. It is a mirror held up to a nation that has strayed, showing the intimate connection between obedience, faithfulness, and the sustaining presence of God. The sight is as terrifying as it is enlightening, for it reveals that the glory which once guided the people through the wilderness, which once made the temple a beacon of hope and worship, is contingent upon their willingness to return to righteousness. Yet even in the sorrow of departure, Ezekiel senses a promise woven through the grief. The withdrawal of the glory is not a final act of annihilation, but a necessary prelude to transformation. By witnessing the holiness depart, the prophet understands that God's justice, though severe, is purposeful, aiming to awaken a stubborn people, to confront them with the consequences of their actions, and to offer a path toward renewal. Ezekiel knows that this vision, though heartbreaking, is a call to awareness, a call to repentance, and ultimately a call to hope. As he stands there, absorbing the weight of what he has seen, Ezekiel recognizes that his mission as watchman is inseparable from this vision. The withdrawal of God's glory illustrates vividly the stakes of his prophetic task. He must warn, he must perform sign acts, he must speak truth even when it is rejected, because the very spiritual life of his people hangs in the balance. The temple's emptiness, the departure of the divine radiance, becomes a living illustration of the peril of spiritual neglect and rebellion, linking seamlessly to the visions by the Kabar River and the dramatic enactments of the siege. The departure of the glory is both an indictment and an invitation, a testament to the consequences of persistent rebellion, and a foreshadowing of restoration if hearts are turned. Ezekiel, standing as the vigilant sentinel, carries this vision within him as a burden and a guiding light. Every warning he delivers, every act of prophecy, echoes the reality of the divine departure, urging the exiles to understand that their destiny is not fixed, that repentance and obedience can restore what rebellion has driven away, and that the presence of God, though momentarily withdrawn, is never beyond reach for those who seek it with sincere hearts. In this sorrowful yet instructive vision, Ezekiel witnesses the delicate interplay between divine holiness and human responsibility, understanding more deeply than ever that prophecy is not merely about prediction, but about illuminating the choices that shape the spiritual and moral fate of a people, binding the past, present, and future into a narrative that challenges, warns, and ultimately offers hope. Even in the midst of the sorrowful visions and the stark warnings of judgment, Ezekiel is shown that God's message is never limited to punishment alone. For within the depths of divine justice lies a profound promise of restoration and renewal, a hope that transcends the devastation of exile and the apparent permanence of human rebellion. As the prophet watches the glory of the Lord depart from the temple, leaving behind walls and altars emptied of their sustaining presence, he is also instructed to see beyond the immediate despair, to recognize that God's ultimate plan is not destruction for its own sake, but the transformation of a people hardened by sin into a community capable of true obedience and heartfelt devotion. This vision, though clothed in the language of metaphor and prophetic imagery, carries a message as tangible as the sign acts Ezekiel has performed. The exile, the famine, the humiliation, and the divine departure are not the end, but the necessary prelude to a renewal that will touch the very essence of the human heart. God reveals to Ezekiel that those who have stubbornly resisted his ways, whose hearts have been like stone, will not remain irreversibly hardened. Instead, in a gesture of unbounded grace, He will remove the heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. A living, responsive, and empathetic core that can receive instruction, feel compassion, and embrace obedience with sincerity. This transformation is not symbolic only. It is a profound metaphysical reality that speaks to the very nature of human potential under divine influence. The hardened heart that once rejected messengers and truth, that once clung to self-interest and rebellion, will be replaced with a capacity to listen, to understand, and to act in alignment with God's will. For Ezekiel, this revelation illuminates the trajectory of his prophetic mission. His warnings, his syntax, and his words of admonition are not merely calls to fear, but invitations to participate in a divine process of inner renewal, an opportunity for hearts and spirits to be reshaped in a way that aligns with the holy presence that had departed Jerusalem. As he contemplates the profound implication of this promise, Ezekiel envisions a people restored to their original purpose, a nation once fractured by corruption and rebellion now made whole through the infusion of a new spirit. The heart of flesh represents more than emotional warmth. It is the embodiment of relational fidelity, moral responsiveness, and spiritual receptivity. With this new heart, the exiles will be capable of understanding the gravity of their actions, feeling genuine remorse for past failures, and cultivating a devotion that is neither mechanical nor coerced, but alive with intentionality and awareness. This transformation also ensures that future disobedience will be met not merely with judgment, but with the sustained presence of God guiding a people whose inner moral compass has been renewed and aligned with divine purpose. The promise of a new spirit accompanying the new heart underscores the holistic nature of this restoration. It is not only the emotional and ethical faculties that are renewed, but the very essence of human motivation, the inner drive that shapes choices and behaviors, is revitalized. Ezekiel sees that the exile is simultaneously a crucible and a seed bed. The trials, the famine, the loss of the temple's glory, and the humiliation experienced by leaders and citizens alike serve to break down hardened resistance, preparing the soil of the human soul to receive the life-giving Spirit of God. This dual movement of heart and spirit ensures that obedience will no longer be superficial, dictated by fear or ritual compliance, but a genuine reflection of inner transformation and alignment with divine will. In this vision, Ezekiel also perceives the implications for the community as a whole. Restoration is not an individualistic gift but a collective renewal. The promise of a new heart and a new spirit extends across generations, offering hope that the failures of one era need not define the next. Leaders who have gone astray, corrupt officials, and ordinary citizens alike are included in the scope of this divine promise, provided they embrace the call to renewed faith and obedience. The symbolism is profound. The nation's identity, fractured by rebellion and exile, is not left to languish in despair, but is actively reshaped through the transformative work of God, binding the community together through shared experience. Accountability, restored spiritual vitality. Ezekiel's understanding deepens as he reflects on the interconnectedness of judgment and restoration. The departure of God's glory, the symbolic acts of famine and defilement, the humiliation of leaders, and the witnessing of exile's consequences all serve a pedagogical purpose, to make the necessity of transformation unmistakable. By illustrating the stark outcomes of persistent rebellion, God creates both urgency and context for the gift of a new heart and spirit, ensuring that when restoration arrives, it is met not with complacency but with readiness to embrace genuine change. Ezekiel realizes that prophecy is therefore not merely a matter of foretelling events, but of shaping moral and spiritual reality, of preparing the human soul to receive the transformative power of divine intervention, and of demonstrating the intimate connection between obedience, responsibility, and the sustaining presence of God. Ultimately, this promise of a new heart, a new spirit encapsulates the essence of hope that threads through Ezekiel's ministry, unifying the visions by the Kabar River, the dramatic enactments of siege, and the departure of God's glory from the temple. It conveys a timeless message that even amidst judgment, despair, and apparent abandonment, the possibility of renewal, transformation, and restored relationship with the divine remains attainable. Through Ezekiel, the exiles witness that the story of God's interaction with humanity is never solely about punishment or despair, but about the profound capacity for change, redemption, and the enduring promise that the hard and rebellious heart can be made soft, the resistant spirit can be made receptive, and the relationship between God and His people can be restored to a vibrancy that surpasses what was lost. This vision, suffused with hope and urgency, propels Ezekiel forward, shaping his warnings, his teachings, and his sign acts with the dual awareness of judgment and renewal, illustrating to every witness, whether in Babylon or beyond, that while rebellion carries consequences, God's transformative power carries the promise of restoration, inviting all who listen to participate in a journey from hardened resistance to renewed devotion, from exile to reconciliation, and from spiritual emptiness to the fullness of a heart and spirit aligned with divine purpose. Following the profound revelations of Israel's exile and the departure of God's glory from the temple, Ezekiel's vision widens to encompass the broader world, revealing the intricate web of divine justice that extends far beyond the boundaries of his own people, stretching across nations that, like Israel, have tested the limits of moral and spiritual responsibility. The prophet is shown that God's sovereignty is not confined to Jerusalem, to the temple, or to the covenant people alone, but governs all nations, commanding history itself with an authority that surpasses human power, ambition, and cunning. It is here, in this expansive vision, that Ezekiel begins to understand that his prophetic mission, while centered on Israel, is also inseparably connected to the fates of neighboring kingdoms whose actions ripple outward, impacting not only themselves but the moral and cosmic order that God sustains. Ezekiel sees the Ammonites first, a people whose pride and cruelty have manifested in repeated aggression toward their neighbors, rejoicing when others suffer, and seeking gain at the expense of justice and mercy. Through the prophet, God announces that their actions, though long unpunished by human standards, will not escape the ultimate reckoning. Their cities, once thought impenetrable and secure, are seen in Ezekiel's vision as fragile constructs, vulnerable to the weight of divine judgment. The vivid imagery of siege, devastation, and inevitable collapse mirrors the lessons he has already witnessed in the siege of Jerusalem, reinforcing the principle that nations, like individuals, are accountable for their choices and cannot rely on temporal power or military strength to evade the consequences of moral failure. From Ammon, Ezekiel's gaze shifts to Edom, a nation whose enmity toward Israel has persisted through generations, their historical grievances amplified into acts of calculated vengeance. In the vision, Edom's leaders are portrayed not merely as political adversaries, but as participants in a spiritual dynamic that resists justice and righteousness. God's message to Edom, delivered through Ezekiel, is precise and uncompromising. The accumulation of malice, the deliberate infliction of harm upon others, will meet a corresponding response. In this way, the prophet communicates the universality of divine accountability, showing that hatred, revenge, and cruelty carry consequences that cannot be avoided, regardless of one's temporal status or geographic position. Next come the Philistines, whose ancient enmity toward Israel has been expressed through repeated assaults and opportunistic aggression. Ezekiel sees them as emblematic of a recurring theme in his visions: nations that thrive on the suffering of others, that glorify themselves in the misfortune of their neighbors, ultimately undermine their own security and spiritual integrity. Through detailed oracles, the prophet conveys that the Philistines, like Israel, are participants in a moral ecosystem in which actions and consequences are tightly interwoven, where the oppression of others sets the stage for eventual reckoning, and where divine sovereignty ensures that no injustice remains unaddressed. Tyrant, cities of wealth, commerce, and influence are next in Ezekiel's vision. These coastal powers, with their extensive trade networks and formidable fortifications, might appear immune to the vicissitudes of fate. Yet God's message through Ezekiel emphasizes that no accumulation of wealth, no clever diplomacy, no seeming invincibility can shield a nation from accountability. The prophet portrays the rulers and inhabitants of these cities, not merely as distant powers, but as participants in the unfolding drama of moral responsibility. Their pride, their exploitation of others, and their attempt to elevate human ambition above divine mandate render them subject to judgment that is both inevitable and instructive, illustrating that the principles of justice and holiness apply universally, not selectively. Egypt, the enduring empire of ancient power and majesty, emerges in Ezekiel's vision as a final exemplar of nations whose influence is vast but whose moral and spiritual posture is flawed. The prophet sees Pharaoh and his advisors as archetypes of arrogance and self-deification, relying on the strength of armies, the abundance of resources, and centuries of cultural dominance to secure their position. Yet, through Ezekiel, God communicates that all of this power is ultimately subordinate to divine authority. Egypt's impending desolation, though devastating, is framed not as arbitrary punishment but as a demonstration of God's sovereignty, reminding all nations that their achievements, no matter how grand, cannot nullify moral responsibility or escape the ultimate judgment that attends persistent pride and oppression. Ezekiel's oracles to these nations are imbued with vivid imagery: cities reduced to rubble, armies scattered, leaders humiliated, and the land itself marked by the consequences of human choices. Through these prophetic declarations, Ezekiel conveys the universality of divine oversight, showing that Israel's exile and judgment are part of a larger moral order in which all nations are accountable for their actions. This broader perspective links seamlessly to the earlier visions by the Kabar River, the departure of the glory from Jerusalem, and the promise of restoration through a new heart and spirit, illustrating that divine sovereignty is both just and purposeful across the human landscape. As Ezekiel witnesses the impending fates of these surrounding nations, he also understands that God's judgments are not motivated by capriciousness, but by the necessity of maintaining justice and order. Each oracle, each declaration of impending consequence, serves to illustrate that human power, influence, or lineage cannot nullify responsibility, and that moral and spiritual integrity are the ultimate determinants of a nation's endurance and prosperity. The prophet sees the interconnectedness of history, human choice, and divine will, recognizing that the lessons for Israel are mirrored in the surrounding nations. No society, regardless of strength or ambition, can evade the ramifications of rebellion, cruelty, or arrogance. Through this comprehensive vision, Ezekiel is equipped to communicate to the exiles not only the imminence of their own trials and the hope of restoration, but also the larger truth that the God who judges is sovereign over all creation, that his authority transcends borders, empires, and human schemes, and that justice and righteousness are not localized concepts but universal imperatives. The prophet comes to understand that his mission, while intimately tied to Israel's restoration, is also a testament to the reach of divine sovereignty, offering insight, warning, and instruction that extends across nations and generations, revealing a God whose power, wisdom, and justice encompass the entire human story. In this way, Ezekiel's oracles against Ammon, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, and Egypt weave a narrative of universal accountability, linking Israel's trials, the departure of the divine glory, and the promise of a renewed heart and spirit to a broader vision of God's governance over all peoples. Through these interconnected revelations, the prophet illustrates that the moral and spiritual order established by God is not limited by geography or political circumstance, and that His sovereignty, though sometimes slow to manifest in human eyes, ensures that justice, restoration, and divine authority prevail across the entirety of creation. After conveying the oracles of judgment against Israel and the surrounding nations, Ezekiel is drawn into a vision that shifts the focus from devastation and exile to the astonishing promise of restoration and life. A vision that would come to symbolize the indomitable hope inherent in God's plan for His people. In the midst of a desolate valley, littered with dry bones bleached by sun and wind, Ezekiel is commanded by God to stand among them and deliver a prophecy unlike any he has spoken before, one that stretches the limits of imagination and the understanding of the human heart, calling him to speak life into what appears utterly lifeless and beyond redemption. The scene is overwhelming in its bleakness. The bones lie scattered and fragmented, a silent testament to generations of destruction, rebellion, and despair. Yet within this stark landscape, Ezekiel perceives the divine imperative that nothing, no matter how broken or forsaken, lies beyond the reach of God's transformative power. As he begins to prophesy, Ezekiel is instructed to declare God's words directly to the bones, to speak of resurrection, renewal, and restoration, and in doing so, he becomes the conduit through which divine breath and purpose flow into the valley. With each utterance, the impossible begins to unfold. Bones move, tendons appear, flesh forms, and skin stretches over the newly assembled frames, bringing the long-dead skeletons to a miraculous semblance of life. The imagery is both visceral and awe-inspiring, illustrating that restoration is not an abstract concept, but a concrete reality that involves transformation of the very substance of existence. This dramatic moment links directly to Ezekiel's earlier experiences by the Kabar River, where visions of divine glory and the four living creatures conveyed God's presence in overwhelming majesty. Here, the same divine authority extends into the realm of the seemingly impossible, animating what was once completely lifeless. As the vision progresses, Ezekiel observes the final and most essential component of this miracle, the breath of life, the ruach, the spirit that animates flesh and bone, entering the newly restored forms. It is a powerful reminder that physical restoration alone does not suffice. True renewal requires the infusion of spirit, the animating presence of God that transforms mere restoration into living, responsive beings capable of relationship, obedience, and purpose. In this way, the Valley of Dry Bones becomes a profound metaphor for the condition of Israel itself, a people scattered across foreign lands, spiritually exhausted, demoralized, and seemingly beyond hope, yet whose destiny remains intimately tied to the promises of God, and whose collective revival can be brought about through divine intervention. Patient guidance and faithful proclamation. The symbolism resonates deeply within the broader narrative of Ezekiel's prophetic ministry. Just as the people of Israel had witnessed the departure of God's glory from the temple, signaling judgment and the consequences of persistent rebellion, they are now presented with the ultimate counterpoint, a vision that demonstrates God's capacity to restore, rejuvenate, and reclaim what had been lost. Ezekiel's role in speaking to the bones parallels his earlier role as watchman, calling the exiles to recognize consequences and make moral and spiritual decisions. Yet it also surpasses it, for in this instance he is invited to participate actively in the miraculous enactment of God's restorative plan. The bones, once inert, become living testimony to the power of prophetic word when aligned with divine will, illustrating the dynamic interplay between human obedience, spiritual responsibility, and God's transformative sovereignty. As the valley teems with movement and the newly formed bodies stand upright, Ezekiel perceives a larger, almost cosmic dimension of God's promise. This is not merely about bringing individuals back to life, but about reconstituting a nation, unifying a dispersed people, and establishing a future that surpasses the limitations imposed by exile and oppression. The vision conveys that God's restoration is both holistic and enduring, encompassing physical, spiritual, and communal renewal, such that the restored people are equipped not only to survive but to flourish, to live in alignment with divine law, and to embody the moral and spiritual lessons learned through trials and judgment. In this narrative arc, the miracle of the dry bones serves as a powerful bridge between the earlier themes of Ezekiel's ministry: the departure of the divine presence, the necessity of moral and spiritual accountability, the universality of divine sovereignty over surrounding nations, and the promise of an inner transformation through a new heart and new spirit. Each element of the vision reinforces the others, showing that judgment and hope are not contradictory but complementary, that the harsh realities of exile and rebellion prepare the ground for the extraordinary revival of life, spirit, and purpose, and that God's ultimate plan is measured not by temporary setbacks, but by the enduring capacity for renewal and restoration. Ezekiel's experience with the dry bones also carries a deeply personal dimension, for it illustrates the intimate relationship between the prophet and the divine plan. Just as he had been charged with faithfully delivering warnings and performing sign acts to convey God's message, he is now entrusted with speaking life into what seems impossible, reinforcing the principle that prophetic words, when aligned with divine authority, possess power beyond human comprehension. The valley of dry bones, though desolate and silent, responds to the voice of obedience, demonstrating that faithful action within God's mandate can become the conduit for miraculous transformation, both for individuals and for nations. As the bones rise and breathe once more, Ezekiel is given a vision of Israel's future that is filled with hope, continuity, and divine intentionality, a nation that, despite exile and dispersion, will be reassembled, renewed, and made vibrant once again, capable of embracing a covenantal relationship with God, unified in purpose, and strengthened by the lessons of the past. This vision embodies the ultimate promise of Ezekiel's ministry, linking the awe-inspiring glory he witnessed by the Kabar River, the warnings delivered through his sign acts, the departure and eventual return of God's presence, the transformation of hearts and spirits, and the demonstration of God's authority over all nations into a single, coherent, and compelling narrative of hope, redemption, and miraculous restoration. In this extraordinary moment, the prophecy of the dry bones becomes a symbol that transcends time and circumstance, offering viewers and readers alike a message that resonates across generations. Even in the most desolate circumstances, when all seems lost and beyond repair, the power of God's word, the promise of divine restoration, and the possibility of new life remain real, accessible, and transformative, inviting every witness to recognize that no valley is too barren, no heart too hardened, and no nation too fractured for the renewing work of the divine hand to bring forth resurrection, hope, and enduring life. As Ezekiel's prophetic journey unfolds, moving from the desolate valley of dry bones to the restored hope of a renewed Israel, his visions expand even further, encompassing a scale and scope that transcend the immediate temporal concerns of his people. venturing into the dramatic or inspiring panorama of what has come to be understood as the end times, a period when the culmination of history itself will bear witness to the supreme authority and holiness of God. In this vision, Ezekiel sees an immense and organized force, a coalition of nations led by a figure identified as Gog of Magog, advancing against the land of Israel with an intensity and coordination that leaves no doubt of the magnitude of the threat, a threat that appears unstoppable by human standards. Embodying both political cunning and martial might, the prophet is acutely aware, as he observes the advance of this formidable army, that the scenario before him is unlike anything the world has ever seen. A convergence of forces from the far north, drawn together by motives that are not merely political or territorial, but deeply aligned with opposition to God's purposes. As if the rebellion of human ambition itself has been personified in the figure of Gog and the coalition he commands. Ezekiel watches as the vast host moves with relentless precision, their ranks forming an almost impenetrable cloud over the land, advancing like a storm that darkens the earth and seems to cover every horizon, a tangible representation of the human capacity for defiance when left to its own devices. Yet, within this terrifying display, the prophet perceives the unmistakable presence of divine sovereignty, for God has revealed that this massive incursion, though motivated by hostility and malice, will ultimately serve a purpose far beyond human comprehension. The invasion is not merely a tale of destruction and fear. It is designed to manifest God's power, holiness, and supreme authority before all nations, a demonstration that the human scheming of empires, kings, and warriors cannot thwart the divine will, and that even the most organized and determined opposition is subordinate to the inexhaustible wisdom and justice of the Creator. Through Ezekiel, God conveys the detailed strategy and outcome of this monumental conflict, showing that the army of Gog, despite its overwhelming numbers and formidable weaponry, is destined to encounter resistance that is both supernatural and morally instructive. The prophet sees the forces of Gog striking at Israel with all the confidence and hubris of those who believe in the sufficiency of their own power. Yet their assault is met with a divine response that transcends ordinary warfare. Natural calamities, inexplicable fear, and events that shatter the cohesion and morale of the coalition, leaving clear evidence that the outcome is determined not by human might but by God's direct intervention. This vision links profoundly with Ezekiel's earlier experiences of divine judgment and restoration. From the departure of God's glory from the temple to the raising of dry bones, illustrating a consistent theme that the Creator governs both the fates of nations and the moral arc of history, and that every act of defiance carries inevitable consequences. Ezekiel perceives that the ultimate purpose of this end-times invasion is not solely punitive but also revelatory. Through the defeat of Gog and his allies, God's holiness is made manifest to all the peoples of the earth, showing that his authority cannot be contested and that moral order, justice, and divine intention govern the unfolding of historical events. The prophet observes the aftermath in vivid detail. The vast armies lie defeated, their power dismantled, their pride humiliated, and the land itself bears witness to the comprehensive nature of divine judgment. The imagery recalls earlier scenes in Ezekiel's visions where nations such as Tyre, Sidon, and Egypt faced judgment, yet on an exponentially larger scale, emphasizing that God's reach extends beyond local politics to the orchestration of global events, revealing that human power, no matter how grand or well organized, is ultimately subordinate to divine sovereignty. Within this vision, Ezekiel is also shown the practical and spiritual dimensions of God's intervention. The cleanup of the battlefield, the burial of the dead, and the restoration of the land serve as a metaphor for the thoroughness of divine justice, reflecting the earlier lessons he delivered to Israel regarding moral responsibility and the consequences of rebellion. The prophet witnesses the meticulousness with which God's plan unfolds. No act of wickedness escapes attention. No display of hubris goes unchallenged, and every nation, regardless of its distance or power, is included in the moral calculus that governs history. This scene reinforces the earlier promise of restoration, showing that even amidst the most overwhelming display of judgment, God's hand remains focused on ultimate renewal and the establishment of order that reflects His holiness and purpose. Ezekiel perceives that this confrontation is also pedagogical, teaching not only the rebellious nations but also Israel itself about the seriousness of divine authority, the inevitability of accountability, and the ultimate futility of defying God's will. The vision is dramatic, terrifying, and awe-inspiring, yet it carries a profound hope. The people who have been scattered, oppressed, and tested through centuries of exile are reminded that God's plan for their restoration is active, powerful, and undeniable. Just as He had breathed life into dry bones and promised a new heart and a new spirit, so too does this end times demonstration assure the faithful that the power of God is unmatched and that His purposes, no matter how long in unfolding, will be accomplished. Through the figure of Gog of Magog and the catastrophic invasion he leads, Ezekiel is given a lens through which to understand the ultimate triumph of divine sovereignty over human rebellion, the universality of God's authority across nations, and the inescapable consequences of pride, ambition, and defiance. The vision binds together the themes of judgment, restoration, and divine intervention, echoing the departure and return of God's glory from the temple, the raising of the dry bones, and the promise of hearts of flesh, showing that history, from the local to the cosmic scale, is governed by moral and spiritual principles that transcend human understanding yet remain vividly manifest in the course of events. By the end of this awe-inspiring vision, Ezekiel understands that the end times invasion is not a story of despair but of ultimate revelation. It is a dramatic testament to the power, holiness, and authority of God, a reminder to all nations of their accountability, and a reassurance to Israel that their restoration and divine favor are assured, despite the trials, judgments, and upheavals that history may impose. In this way, the prophecy of Gog of Magog unifies the narrative of Ezekiel's visions into a coherent tapestry of divine justice, transformative hope, and unassailable sovereignty, linking the immediate experiences of exile with the ultimate destiny of Israel and the demonstration of God's glory to the entire world. After decades of exile, judgment, and prophetic revelations, Ezekiel is brought into a vision so profound and intricate that it transcends any earthly understanding, revealing not only the physical restoration of his homeland, but also the spiritual renewal of a people who have endured generations of displacement and moral turmoil. In this vision, God unfolds before Ezekiel a detailed architectural blueprint for a future temple, a sacred space meticulously designed to embody divine order, holiness, and perfection, a stark contrast to the temple whose glory had once departed due to Israel's rebellion. Every measurement, gate, and inner courtyard is described with astonishing precision, revealing a structure that is not merely functional but symbolic, a living testament to God's meticulous care and His desire for His people to experience worship in a manner that reflects both reverence and spiritual alignment. Ezekiel walks through this vision, noting the symmetry of the outer and inner courts, the careful proportions of porticos, and the arrangement of sacred spaces, each designed to guide the worshipper into a deeper awareness of the Creator's majesty, and to ensure that the purity of the sacred environment mirrors the spiritual transformation God intends for His people. As Ezekiel observes the temple's layout, he witnesses the return of God's glory, the same radiant presence that had once departed from the temple in Jerusalem when the people's hearts became hardened and their actions corrupted, leaving the sanctuary empty and desolate. The glory does not merely hover at the entrance or over the altar, but fills the entire structure, saturating every chamber, every gate, every court with light, radiance, and sanctity, signifying that the relationship between God and His people is restored, unbroken, and infused with a renewed sense of divine purpose. This return of God's presence is intertwined with a transformation in the hearts of the people, echoing the promise of a new heart and a new spirit that had replaced their hearts of stone with hearts of flesh, making them capable of authentic worship, obedience, and devotion in a land that has been physically reconstructed and spiritually revitalized. Ezekiel's vision is not limited to architecture and presence. It extends into the practicalities of worship and priestly service, establishing renewed regulations that safeguard the sanctity of the sacred spaces and ensure that devotion to God remains untainted by the mistakes of the past. He sees the priests instructed in precise attire, wearing linen turbans and garments that reflect purity, free from any traces of sweat or labor, symbolizing that their service is to be an expression of reverence and spiritual cleanliness rather than mere ritualistic duty. The vision emphasizes that worship is not a casual or perfunctory act, but a deliberate alignment of heart, mind, and body with the divine will, a commitment that requires attention to detail, dedication, and awareness of the moral and spiritual responsibilities inherent in serving a holy God. The spatial arrangement of the temple itself, with its inner sanctums, gates, and porticos, is designed to facilitate a worship experience that is both orderly and immersive, guiding the community into encounters with God's glory that are transformative and unifying. Beyond the physical and ritual aspects, Ezekiel sees the broader implications of this restored temple. It becomes a symbol of justice, equality, and permanence. The land surrounding the temple is to be redistributed among the 12 tribes, ensuring that each group receives an equitable portion, a tangible manifestation of divine fairness and long-term societal stability. Rivers flowing from the sanctuary create life, nourishing the land and producing fruit-bearing trees whose leaves serve for healing and whose fruit provides sustenance year-round. A vivid metaphor for the ongoing provision and care of God for His people, linking spiritual nourishment with physical abundance. These waters, flowing from the heart of the temple, signify that God's presence is not static or confined but dynamic and life-giving, reaching every corner of the renewed land and ensuring that the covenant relationship is manifested in both spiritual vitality and material prosperity. Ezekiel also comprehends that this vision connects deeply with the broader themes of his prophetic ministry. The meticulous planning, the return of divine glory, the purity of worship, and the equitable distribution of the land all reflect a holistic restoration that encompasses moral, spiritual, and communal dimensions. It ties back to the raising of the dry bones, symbolizing resurrection and hope, the giving of new hearts and new spirits, representing moral and spiritual renewal, and the judgment upon surrounding nations, demonstrating God's sovereignty and justice on a global scale. Through this vision, Ezekiel sees a future where past failures, rebellion, and spiritual corruption have been replaced with obedience, devotion, and alignment with God's perfect will. A land transformed not only by reconstruction but by divine guidance and enduring righteousness. This temple vision is the culmination of Ezekiel's prophetic journey, uniting the lessons of exile, judgment, restoration, and divine sovereignty into a coherent and awe-inspiring narrative that underscores God's meticulous care for His people, His uncompromising holiness, and His unyielding commitment to restoring humanity to its intended purpose. In this vision, every architectural detail, every instruction for worship, and every element of the land's renewal resonates with the central theme of God's glory, returning to dwell among His people, demonstrating that true restoration involves not only physical rebuilding but also spiritual revival. Ethical realignment. and the cultivation of a community capable of sustaining covenantal relationship for generations to come. Ezekiel emerges from this vision with an understanding that the temple is far more than stone and wood. It is a living, breathing manifestation of divine presence, a beacon of hope, a model for faithful worship, and a testament to God's eternal plan, uniting heaven and earth in a tangible and transformative expression of holiness, justice, and life. As Ezekiel's vision reaches its astonishing climax, the prophet is drawn to a scene of unparalleled beauty and divine symbolism. A river, shimmering with a brilliance that seems almost otherworldly, flowing steadily from the very heart of the newly revealed temple. This river is not an ordinary stream. It is a life-giving force, a divine artery running through the renewed land, carrying with it vitality, healing, and abundance wherever its waters touch. Ezekiel notices how the river grows in depth and breadth as it progresses, gradually transforming the surrounding terrain into a flourishing paradise, where barren lands become verdant, trees bear fruit year-round, and the soil itself seems infused with the Spirit of God's restorative power. The fish multiply abundantly in its currents, and the vegetation along its banks thrives beyond natural expectation, symbolizing the extraordinary provision that accompanies the presence of the Creator. The leaves of these miraculous trees provide continual healing, a vivid metaphor for the restoration of the human spirit and the renewal of the community's moral and spiritual health, reflecting God's promise to replace hearts of stone with hearts of flesh. As the waters advance, Ezekiel sees how every element of the land benefits from the river's divine flow, bringing balance and harmony to a world long marked by exile, division, and spiritual desolation. This river unites the scattered fragments of a broken nation, nourishing them into cohesion and strength, mirroring the broader mission of his prophetic ministry, to awaken Israel from despair, guide them back to righteousness, and cultivate a society capable of sustaining covenantal life. In this vision, the river becomes a tangible representation of God's mercy and unrelenting commitment to his people, showing that restoration is not merely about physical rebuilding but encompasses the spiritual, emotional, and ethical revival of a community that has endured suffering, rebellion, and judgment. Each tributary, each flowing current, embodies the promise of God's continuous care, ensuring that his people are neither abandoned nor left to the frailty of their own devices, but are instead sustained by a presence that is eternal, generous, and unshakable. Ezekiel follows the river to its ultimate destination, witnessing the emergence of a city whose very name declares the essence of God's promise. The Lord is there. This city is unlike any human settlement. It is a theological statement manifested in stone, river, and landscape. Its name proclaims a reality that transcends geography or political influence. God himself dwells permanently among his people, no longer as a distant presence observed only in fleeting visions, but as an abiding, life-giving force that shapes every aspect of daily existence. Here, the lessons of exile, judgment, and restoration converge into a vivid picture of divine fidelity, illustrating that God's ultimate intention is not to punish without purpose, but to redeem, to reconcile, and to provide a sanctuary in which his people may flourish under his guidance. The city becomes a symbol of hope for all generations, a reminder that even after the most devastating trials, there is the possibility of renewal, abundance, and intimacy with the Creator. Within this renewed city, Ezekiel observes a community transformed by God's presence. The people live in harmony, guided by ethical principles, spiritual awareness, and a shared commitment to justice and faithfulness. They engage in worship that is both reverent and joyous, reflecting the restored covenant between God and his people. There is a palpable sense of order and holiness in their daily lives, showing that the divine presence has reshaped not only the physical environment, but also the character and priorities of the inhabitants. The river continues to flow through the city, a constant reminder that God's provision, guidance, and healing are ongoing, not confined to a single moment or event. Its waters sustain agriculture, nourish families, and provide a vivid illustration of how divine care permeates all aspects of life, reinforcing the lessons of Ezekiel's earlier visions. Judgment is not arbitrary, restoration is real, and God's plan is comprehensive, integrating the spiritual, moral, and physical dimensions of human existence. As the vision concludes, Ezekiel reflects on the journey from exile to restoration, from desolation to divine glory, understanding that the river and the city of the Lord is there encapsulate the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises. The imagery of flowing waters, fruit-bearing trees, and a city bathed in divine presence leaves no doubt that God's intention is not temporary reprieve, but enduring renewal, a covenantal relationship in which His people are sustained, healed, and guided toward righteousness. This vision offers a profound lesson for all who encounter it. No matter how dire circumstances may appear, no matter the depth of suffering, rebellion, or loss, God's power to restore, to transform, and to dwell with His people is absolute and unfailing. Through this remarkable conclusion, Ezekiel's narrative comes full circle, linking the earliest visions by the Kabar River, the prophetic warnings to Israel, the raising of dry bones, the judgments against surrounding nations, and the end-times scenarios with a final, resounding message of hope and renewal. The river, the city, and the restored community serve as enduring symbols of God's mercy, fidelity, and transformative power, offering viewers both awe and inspiration, a vivid reminder that divine presence can bring life where there was once death, healing where there was brokenness, and unity where there was division. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the life and visions of Ezekiel. If you have been inspired by this story of judgment, hope, and ultimate restoration, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an exploration of these extraordinary biblical narratives. Your support helps us continue to bring these ancient stories to life. Connecting history, prophecy, and timeless lessons in ways that resonate with today's world.